The crowd's roar swallowed Beatrice Osborne's screams as rough hands shoved her onto the makeshift auction stage, the rope around her wrists cutting into her skin as she struggled against her captors. Montana Territory, 1876, was no place for a woman alone, a lesson she was learning in the most brutal way imaginable. "Next up, gentlemen, a fine specimen of womanhood," the auctioneer bellowed, his voice carrying across the dusty mining town square. "Fresh from Boston with breeding and education. Starting bid at $50. Beatrice's honey blonde hair fell in tangled waves around her face as she lifted her chin defiantly, despite the terror coursing through her veins. 3 days ago, she had been traveling west to take a position as a schoolteacher. Now, kidnapped by outlaws who had ambushed her stagecoach, she was being sold like cattle to the highest bidder. The leering faces of miners, drifters, and drunkards swam before her eyes as the bidding began. $50, $75, $100. The price of her life and dignity rising with each shout. From the back of the crowd, a tall figure watched, his features obscured by the shadow of his hat brim. Russell O'Malley's hand rested on his holstered Colt as his jaw tightened at the spectacle before him. He had ridden into Copper Creek following rumors of a human trafficking ring, not expecting to witness an auction in broad daylight. The lawlessness of this corner of the territory had reached new depths. $200. Shouted a pot-bellied man with tobacco-stained teeth to approving whoops from his companions. $250, countered a scarred miner, eyes gleaming with malice. Russ had seen enough. His spurs jangled softly as he moved toward the stage, calculating his odds against the 6 armed men guarding the proceedings. Poor, but he'd faced worse. $500, he called out, his voice cutting through the crowd like a knife. A hush fell as heads turned. The auctioneer's eyes lit up at the substantial bid. $500 from the gentleman in the back. Do I hear $550? The scarred miner cursed but shook his head. The pot-bellied man glared but remained silent. Going once, going twice, the auctioneer cried, raising his gavel. Sold. The crack of wood against wood sealed Beatrice's fate. She stared at her purchaser as he approached the stage, her eyes filled with a mixture of terror and fury. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with piercing blue eyes beneath his dark hat. His face was sun-bronzed and weathered, a short beard covering his jawline. Not as crude as the others, but still a man who thought he could buy a woman. "Get your papers and take your property," the auctioneer instructed, gesturing to a table where a man scratched out receipts. Russ approached the stage, eyes locked with Beatrice's. "Stand up," he commanded, his voice low. She struggled to her feet, her legs nearly buckling beneath her. The auctioneer's assistant hauled her forward, the rope around her wrists stretched taut. In one fluid motion, Russ drew a knife from his boot and slashed through the rope binding her. Before anyone could react, he swept Beatrice into his arms and leapt from the stage. "What the hell?" the auctioneer bellowed as chaos erupted. Russ sprinted through the crowd, Beatrice clutched against his chest. Gunshots rang out behind them as he dodged between buildings, heading for the livery where his horse waited. "Stop or we'll shoot the woman," someone shouted. Russ ducked into an alley, setting Beatrice on her feet but keeping a firm grip on her arm. "Can you run?" he asked urgently. "Yes," she gasped, rubbing her chafed wrists. "Then run." He drew his Colt, firing 2 shots over his shoulder to discourage pursuit as they raced toward the stable. His horse, a powerful chestnut gelding, was already saddled. In one motion, Russ hoisted Beatrice onto the saddle, then swung up behind her. He kicked the horse into motion, bursting out of the stable as bullets splintered the wood around them. They thundered down the main street, townspeople scattering before them. At the edge of town, Russ veered off the road into the pines, urging his mount up a steep game trail where horses pursuing them would struggle to follow. Only when they were miles from town, hidden in a dense grove of aspens, did he finally slow the exhausted horse to a walk. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice gentler than before. Beatrice twisted in the saddle to face him, her expression a storm of emotions. "Who are you?" "And what do you think you're doing?" "Saving your life, madam," he replied simply. "Name's Russell O'Malley, most call me Russ." "I don't need to be purchased by one man to escape another," she spat, though her voice trembled. "I didn't purchase you," he said calmly. "I created a distraction." "There's a difference." "Then why? Those men would have followed us regardless. Better they thought I was claiming what I paid for until we could get away." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a badge. "U.S. Marshal, I've been tracking that operation for weeks." Beatrice stared at the badge, her shoulders sagging with relief. I'm sorry, and thank you. I'm Beatrice Osborne." "Miss Osborne," he acknowledged with a slight nod. "We need to keep moving. Those men won't give up easily, especially now that I've cost them money and merchandise." The word made her flinch, but she nodded. "Where are we going?" "I have a cabin about 20 miles north of here. We'll rest there tonight, then I'll take you to Fort Laramie where you'll be safe." He paused. "If that's acceptable to you." It wasn't really a question. They both knew she had no alternatives in this wilderness. Still, his asking meant something. "It's acceptable," she said quietly, turning forward again, as they rode deeper into the wilderness, the enormity of what had nearly happened and what might still happen washed over Beatrice. The tears she had refused to shed in front of her captors now flowed freely down her cheeks. Behind her, Russ pretended not to notice, giving her the dignity of private grief. But his arm around her waist tightened slightly, not possessively, but protectively as they made their way through the gathering darkness. The cabin appeared just as twilight was deepening into night, a small, sturdy structure nestled against a rocky hillside with a clear view of the valley below. Russ helped Beatrice dismount, steadying her when her legs threatened to give way after the long ride. "It's not much," he said, leading her inside after tending to his horse, "but it's secure." The interior was simple but well-maintained. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a rough-hewn table and 2 chairs nearby. A curtain separated what she assumed was a sleeping area from the main room. Everything was meticulously tidy, surprising her. "You live here?" she asked, watching as he lit an oil lamp. "Sometimes," he answered, crouching to build a fire. "I patrol a large territory, keep places like this throughout the range." As warmth began to fill the cabin, Beatrice sank onto one of the chairs, exhaustion overwhelming her. Russ busied himself preparing a simple meal of beans, dried beef, and coffee, giving her space to collect herself. "How did you end up on that auction block?" he finally asked, setting a plate before her. Beatrice stared at the food, her appetite non-existent despite not having eaten for days. "I was traveling from Boston to take a teaching position in Helena. Our stagecoach was attacked 3 days ago. The driver and guard were killed." She swallowed hard. "There were 2 other women. I don't know what happened to them." Russ's expression darkened. "The Blackwell gang. They've been operating along the northern routes for months, taking women, selling them to mining camps where women are scarce." "How could this happen, in America, in 1876? Her voice rose in disbelief. "The law is thin out here," he said grimly. "Men like Blackwell exploit that." He nodded toward her plate. "You should eat. We have a hard ride tomorrow." She forced herself to take a bite, then another, her body's needs overriding her revulsion. They ate in silence for a while. "You're a long way from Boston," Russ observed eventually. "Family, dead," she replied flatly. "My father was a professor. When he passed, I discovered he had left nothing but debts. The teaching position was my chance to start fresh." He nodded, understanding in his eyes. "The West can be that, a fresh start. Or a swift end," she countered bitterly. "That too," he acknowledged. "But you're alive. That counts for something." After they finished eating, Russ showed her where she could wash up using water from a barrel collected from the nearby stream. He gave her one of his clean shirts to sleep in and showed her to the bed behind the curtain. "I'll take the floor out here," he said, gathering blankets. Beatrice hesitated. "Mr. O'Malley, thank you, not just for the rescue but for—" She gestured vaguely, unable to articulate her gratitude for his respect and consideration. "Get some rest, Miss Osborne," he said quietly. Dawn comes early in these mountains. Alone behind the curtain, Beatrice changed quickly, her fingers trembling as she unbuttoned her torn and dirty dress. The marshal's shirt swallowed her slender frame, but it was clean and smelled of soap and pine. She slipped beneath the rough blankets, expecting sleep to claim her immediately. Instead, she lay awake, listening to Russ moving quietly around the main room, banking the fire for the night. The events of the day replayed in her mind the terror of the auction, the rush of escape, the strange sense of security she now felt with a man she'd known for mere hours. In Boston, she had been raised to be wary of men, especially those of lower social standing. But social conventions seemed meaningless now. This rough marshal had shown more honor than many gentlemen of her acquaintance. With that thought, she finally drifted into an exhausted sleep. She woke screaming sometime in the darkest hours of the night, the nightmare of rough hands and leering faces still vivid in her mind. Russ was beside her instantly, a silhouette in the dim light from the banked fire. "You're safe," he said firmly. "You're safe, Miss Osborne." Beatrice clutched the blanket to her chest, gasping for breath. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean to wake you." "I was awake," he said simply, and she realized he had probably been keeping watch. "Would you like some water?" She nodded, and he disappeared, returning moments later with a tin cup. As she drank, her hands steadied. "I keep seeing their faces," she admitted, "hearing their voices as they bit on me like I was livestock." Russ sat on the edge of the bed, respectfully distant. "It'll fade with time." "Will it?" she asked. "Or will I carry this forever?" "You'll carry it," he said honestly. "But it won't always be this sharp. One day it'll be a memory that reminds you how strong you are, not how vulnerable you were." Something in his tone made her look up. "You speak from experience." He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. "Shiloh," he finally said. "I was 19, saw things no man should see, did things no man should have to do. The war. Of course, it had ended 11 years ago, which would put him around 30 now. How did you move beyond it?" She asked, found purpose, became a marshal to make sure others didn't suffer needlessly. He stood. "Try to sleep. I'll be right outside the curtain if you need anything." "Marshal O'Malley," she called softly as he turned to go. Would you mind sitting here until I fall asleep?" "I know it's improper, but nothing about any of this is proper, Miss Osborne," he said, settling back onto the edge of the bed. "But I'll stay." True to his word, he remained sitting upright as she drifted back to sleep, his solid presence keeping the nightmares at bay. Dawn arrived with pale light filtering through the cabin's single window. Beatrice woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of quiet movement. For a moment, disorientation gripped her before the previous day's events came rushing back. She dressed quickly in her own clothes, grimacing at their condition. When she emerged from behind the curtain, Russ was at the stove, his back to her. "Good morning," she said hesitantly. He turned, and she was struck again by his presence. In the morning light, she could better see his features, the strong jawline beneath his short beard, the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the scar that cut through his left eyebrow. "Morning," he replied, pouring coffee into a tin cup and offering it to her. "We should leave within the hour. I expect Blackwell's men are already searching." As if to confirm his words, a distant sound caught their attention. Russ moved swiftly to the window, peering out through a gap in the rough shutters. "Riders," he said grimly. 6, maybe 7, coming up the valley." Beatrice's hand flew to her throat. "How did they find us so quickly?" "Tracker, probably, and I've tangled with Blackwell before. He knows my patterns." Russ moved with practiced efficiency, gathering supplies and weapons. Change of plans. "We can't outrun them on one horse, and we can't stay here." "What do we do?" she asked, fear evident in her voice despite her attempt to control it. "There's a mining claim about 3 miles up the mountain behind us. Abandoned now, but the tunnel runs deep." We can hide there until nightfall, then circle back for the horse and head for Fort Laramie under cover of darkness. He handed her a heavy coat. Put this on. The mountains get cold, even in summer. Beatrice slipped into the coat, which enveloped her completely. Will they burn your cabin? The question seemed to surprise him. Probably. It's just logs and labor, Miss Osborne. Both can be replaced. They slipped out the back door as the riders appeared at the edge of the clearing in front of the cabin. Russ led her up a nearly invisible trail that wound steeply through pine and aspen groves. The going was difficult for Beatrice, unused to mountain terrain and still weak from her ordeal. Halfway up, they paused behind a massive boulder. In the valley below, they could see men surrounding the cabin, weapons drawn. They're being cautious, Russ murmured. Good, buys us time. They think we're still inside, Beatrice asked, trying to catch her breath. For now, once they realize we're gone, they'll start tracking us. He looked at her with concern. How are you holding up? I'll manage, she said, more confidently than she felt. He nodded, a hint of admiration in his eyes. The mine entrance is just over that ridge, not much further. They continued upward, the terrain growing rockier. Beatrice's city boots were not made for such climbing, and she slipped several times. Each time, Russ's strong hand caught her, steadying her without comment. The mine entrance appeared suddenly a dark hole in the mountainside, partially obscured by overgrown brush. Russ cleared away enough of the vegetation for them to slip inside, then carefully rearranged it to hide their passage. The tunnel was damp and cold, the darkness absolute once they moved beyond the entrance. Russ produced a small lantern from his pack and lit it, keeping the flame low. Stay close, he instructed. The main shaft is stable, but there are side tunnels that aren't. Beatrice followed him deeper into the mountain, fighting her instinctive fear of the enclosed space. The tunnel widened into a chamber where mining equipment lay abandoned picks, shovels, and rusted ore carts on narrow tracks. We'll wait here, Russ said, setting his pack down. If they track us this far, we can retreat deeper into the tunnels. They branch and connect throughout the mountain. Easy to get lost if you don't know the way. But you do, she asked, settling onto a relatively dry boulder. I've explored most of them, used to do some prospecting before I took the badge. He began unpacking supplies: jerky, hardtack, a canteen of water. Beatrice accepted the food he offered, watching him as he moved about the chamber, checking the tunnels that branched from it. There was something reassuring about his methodical competence. Tell me about Marshal Russell O'Malley, she said, when he returned to sit across from her. He raised an eyebrow. Not much to tell. I disagree. You've saved my life and shared your food and shelter. I'd like to know something about the man behind these kindnesses. He looked uncomfortable with her characterization. Just doing my job, Miss Osborne. Beatrice, she corrected. After all we've been through, I think we can dispense with formalities. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Beatrice, then. He was quiet for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts. Grew up in Missouri, joined the Union Army at 19. After the war, drifted west like many others. Tried ranching, mining, even drove cattle for a spell. Became a deputy in Denver, then a marshal 3 years ago. Family, she asked. Parents gone, one brother in California, you. No siblings. Mother died when I was young. Father raised me alone. She twisted her hands in her lap. He was a good man, but impractical. A scholar through and through, never understood money. Russ nodded. That's why you took the teaching position? Yes. It was either that, or marry one of my father's colleagues' men 3 times my age, who saw me as little more than a convenient housekeeper with the appropriate social background. She grimaced. I chose independence. And found trouble instead, he observed. Yes, well, perhaps I was naive about the realities of the West. She looked down at her torn dress and dirty hands. Father's books painted a more romantic picture. The West can be beautiful, Russ said quietly, but it's never gentle. A distant sound made them both freeze, voices echoing faintly through the tunnel. They've found our trail, Russ whispered, extinguishing the lantern. Come, quickly and quietly." In the sudden darkness, his hand found hers, warm and calloused. He led her deeper into the mine, navigating by memory and touch. Beatrice's heart pounded as she heard the voices growing louder behind them. They turned into a side tunnel, then another, descending deeper into the mountain. The air grew colder and danker, and Beatrice shivered despite the heavy coat. Eventually, they reached a small chamber where Russ stopped. "Wait here," he whispered. "Don't move." She felt him release her hand and move away. Panic fluttered in her chest at being left alone in the absolute darkness, but she forced herself to remain still and silent. Minutes stretched like hours. The voices had faded, but she couldn't tell if that was because the pursuers had given up or simply because she and Russ had put enough distance between them. Then she heard a scraping sound nearby, followed by Russ's voice, barely audible. "Beatrice, this way." She moved toward his voice, hands outstretched until they contacted what felt like solid rock. "I don't understand," she whispered. His hand found hers again, guiding it to a narrow gap between rocks. "It's a false wall. Miners built it to hide a rich vein from claim jumpers. Squeeze through." The opening was tight, but she managed to slip through into another passage. Russ followed, then carefully moved rocks to conceal the entrance behind them. Only when he was satisfied did he risk lighting the lantern again, revealing a small natural cavern with a pool of clear water at its center. "They won't find us here," he said confidently. "Few people know about this place." "How long will we need to hide?" Beatrice asked, sinking down onto a relatively flat rock beside the pool. "Until nightfall, at least. Maybe longer if they're persistent." He knelt beside the pool and filled his canteen. "The water's good, spring-fed." Beatrice cupped her hands and drank, the cold water reviving her. Then, noticing her reflection in the pool's surface, she grimaced. Her face was smudged with dirt, her hair a tangled mess. Without thinking, she loosened her hair and bent to wash her face. When she looked up, she caught Russ watching her, an unreadable expression in his eyes. He quickly looked away. "Sorry," he muttered. "Didn't mean to stare." "It's all right," she said, feeling a blush rise to her cheeks. "I must look a fright." "No," he said simply, still not looking at her. "You don't." An awkward silence fell between them, broken only by the occasional drip of water from the cavern's ceiling. "May I ask you something personal, Marshal?" Beatrice finally said. "Russ," he corrected. "And you can ask, might not answer." "Fair enough," she hesitated. "Have you ever been married?" Now he did look at her, surprise evident in his expression. "No, never found the time or the right woman." He paused. "Or maybe never found a woman who wanted a life following a marshal around the territories." "It would be a challenging life," she acknowledged. "What about you?" he asked. "No suitors in Boston," Beatrice laughed softly. "None that interested me." "As I said, my options were limited to my father's aging colleagues." She traced patterns in the dirt with her finger. "I had hoped that in Montana I might meet someone different, someone who saw me as more than a suitable match or a potential caretaker." "What did you hope to find?" His voice was quiet, genuinely curious. She considered the question. "Partnership, I suppose, mutual respect, maybe even passion, though proper Boston ladies aren't supposed to think of such things." Her cheeks burned at the admission. Russ's eyes held hers for a long moment. "Proper Boston ladies probably don't find themselves hiding in abandoned mines with strange marshals either." The observation startled a laugh from her. "No, I suppose not." His smile transformed his face, softening the hard lines and lighting his blue eyes. It struck Beatrice that he was handsome in a rugged, weathered way that no Boston gentleman could match. The realization unsettled her. This was hardly the time or place for such thoughts. She was still in danger, still traumatized from her near sail into what would have essentially been slavery. And yet, in this strange hideaway deep within a mountain, with a man she barely knew but inexplicably trusted, she felt something shifting inside her perspective on what mattered, on what kind of life she wanted, on what kind of man might share it. "We should rest while we can," Russ said, breaking the moment. It'll be a long night of travel once we leave here." He offered her his rolled jacket as a pillow, insisting she take it despite her protests. As they settled into an uneasy rest, Beatrice found herself wondering what would happen when they reached Fort Laramie. Would Russ simply deliver her to safety and continue his pursuit of Blackwell? The thought left her with an unexpected hollow feeling. Hours passed in the dimly lit cavern. They spoke intermittently, sharing stories from their lives, Russ's adventures as a young deputy in Denver, Beatrice's more sheltered but intellectually rich upbringing in Boston. Despite their vastly different backgrounds, they discovered shared values, a love of literature, Russ surprising her with his knowledge of Thoreau and Emerson, a dislike of pretense, a belief in justice. When Russ judged it safe to leave, night had fallen. They made their way carefully back through the mine tunnels, emerging under a sky brilliant with stars. "Beautiful," Beatrice breathed, gazing upward. "One of the things I love about the West," Russ agreed. "You never see stars like this in the cities." They descended the mountains slowly, alert for any sign of Blackwell's men. When they reached the cabin, they found it ransacked but not burned. "They're probably watching the trails," Russ said as he quickly gathered additional supplies. "We'll have to take a route they won't expect." He led his horse from its hiding place in a stand of trees where he had concealed it before their flight up the mountain. Once again, Beatrice found herself riding double with Russ, his arms around her as he held the reins. Instead of taking the main trail down the valley, he guided the horse along a barely visible path that hugged the mountainside, often passing through streams to hide their tracks. They rode through the night, stopping only briefly to rest the horse. By dawn, they had covered significant ground, emerging from the mountains into rolling prairie. Russ found a sheltered hollow where they could rest during daylight hours, hidden from view. "We're making good time," he said as they shared a meager breakfast. "Should reach Fort Laramie in 2 more days if we keep this pace." Beatrice nodded, trying not to show her disappointment at the thought of their journey ending. "And then what happens? You'll be safe there. The commander is a friend. He'll arrange an escort to Helena if you still want to take that teaching position." "And you," Russ's jaw tightened, "I'll go after Blackwell. What happened to you and those other women can't go unpunished." "It's dangerous," she said quietly. "It's my job." His tone was final, but his eyes held something softer when they met hers. They rested through the hot daylight hours, taking turns keeping watch. As twilight approached, Beatrice woke from a light sleep to find Russ sitting nearby, his expression troubled. "What is it?" she asked, sitting up. "Riders," he said grimly. "Coming from the east, not Blackwell's men soldiers, I think. Isn't that good news?" "Should be," he acknowledged. "But something feels wrong. They're moving too purposefully, like they know where they're going." He crept to the edge of their hiding place, Beatrice following. In the distance, a dust cloud marked the approach of at least a dozen riders. "Fort Laramie patrol?" she suggested. "Maybe." Russ didn't sound convinced. "Stay here, I'm going to get a closer look." Before she could protest, he had slipped away, moving from cover to cover until he disappeared from view. Beatrice waited anxiously, watching the distant riders grow closer. When Russ returned, his expression was grim. "Army patrol, but they're riding with 2 men I recognize from Copper Creek. Blackwell must have connections at the fort. What does that mean for us?" "It means Fort Laramie isn't safe." He ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "We need a new plan." "Where can we go?" Beatrice asked, fear creeping back into her voice. Russ thought for a moment. "There's a settlement about 40 miles northwest of here. Settlers Creek, small ranching community. I helped the sheriff there last year with some cattle rustlers. We could find refuge there while I send word to my superiors in Denver. Can we reach it before those soldiers find us?" "If we ride hard and avoid the main trails." He began gathering their few possessions. "We need to move now, before they pick up our trail." Once again, they mounted the increasingly weary horse and set off, this time heading northwest across open prairie. The land offered less cover than the mountains, making them more vulnerable, but also allowing them to see pursuers from a greater distance. They rode through the night, stopping only when the horse needed rest. Beatrice, exhausted but determined, did not complain even as her body ached from the unaccustomed riding. Dawn found them crossing a shallow river, the water reaching the horse's belly. Russ guided the animal downstream for nearly a mile before emerging on the opposite bank, a tactic to throw off trackers. "There's a line shack about 5 miles ahead," he told Beatrice. "Belongs to the Circle R Ranch. We can rest there for a few hours." The shack proved to be little more than a one-room shelter used by cowboys during roundup, but it offered concealment and the luxury of a rough bunk. Russ insisted Beatrice take it while he kept watch. "You need rest too," she protested. "I've gone longer without sleep," he assured her, but the dark circles under his eyes betrayed his exhaustion. Beatrice settled onto the bunk, intending only to close her eyes for a moment. Instead, she fell into a deep sleep, waking with a start when Russ shook her shoulder gently. "We need to move," he said urgently. "Riders coming from the south." The pursuit was relentless. For 2 more days, they traveled mostly at night, resting during daylight in whatever concealment they could find. The constant tension and physical hardship took its toll on both of them, but particularly on Beatrice, who had never experienced such conditions. On the 3rd morning after leaving Russ's cabin, they crested a rise to see a small settlement nestled in a valley below Settlers Creek. The sight of civilization, even this frontier version of it, brought tears to Beatrice's eyes. "We made it," she whispered. Russ's arm tightened briefly around her waist. "Not quite yet. We need to be careful. Blackwell might have men here too." They approached the town cautiously, Russ choosing a route that brought them in from the west rather than the more obvious southern trail. The settlement was small, a main street with a general store, saloon, blacksmith, and a dozen other businesses, surrounded by scattered houses and corrals. Russ guided them directly to a small building with a sign identifying it as the sheriff's office. He dismounted first, then helped Beatrice down, supporting her when her legs threatened to buckle. "Wait here," he instructed, leaving her with the horse while he entered the office. He emerged moments later with another man older, with a silver mustache and weathered face beneath a wide-brimmed hat. The star on his chest marked him as the local law. "Miss Osborne, this is Sheriff Tanner. He's going to help us." The sheriff tipped his hat. "Madam." "Marshal O'Malley tells me you've had a rough time of it. Let's get you somewhere safe and comfortable." He led them down the street to a small house set back from the main road. A plump woman with kind eyes answered the door, looking curiously at the bedraggled pair. "Martha, these folks need shelter and discretion," the sheriff said. "The lady especially needs some looking after." Come in," Martha urged, ushering them inside. "Land's sakes, child, you look half dead on your feet." Within an hour, Beatrice found herself bathed, dressed in a borrowed nightgown, and tucked into a real bed for the first time in nearly a week. Martha, the sheriff's wife, had fussed over her, providing hot food and gentle care that brought fresh tears to Beatrice's eyes. "Your husband?" she asked Russ before giving in to exhaustion. "Is he safe? Getting some rest at the sheriff's office," Martha assured her. "Don't you worry about him. That one's tougher than old leather." But Beatrice did worry, even as sleep claimed her. Somewhere out there, Blackwell's men and possibly corrupt soldiers were still searching. And Russ, she knew, would not rest until he was sure she was truly safe. She slept deeply, waking only when late afternoon sunlight streamed through the curtains. For a moment, disorientation gripped her before she remembered where she was. The sounds of a small town going about its business drifted through the open window, horses, wagons, voices calling greetings. Martha brought her a simple dress that fit reasonably well. "Sheriff's daughter left it when she married and moved to Denver," she explained. "Should do until we can get your things properly sorted." "You're very kind," Beatrice said, genuinely touched by the woman's generosity. Nonsense. Any decent person would do the same. Martha's expression darkened. What those men tried to do to you? Well, there's a special place in hell for the likes of them. After dressing, Beatrice was led to the kitchen where a late meal awaited. To her surprise and relief, Russ was there, freshly shaved and wearing clean clothes, though his ever-present gun belt remained at his hip. He stood when she entered, his eyes taking in her transformation. "You look rested," he said awkwardly. "As do you," she replied, noticing how the clean shirt emphasized the breadth of his shoulders. Martha busied herself serving food, her knowing smile suggesting she wasn't oblivious to the currents between them. "Sheriff Tanner sent a telegram to my superiors in Denver," Russ explained as they ate. "Also put out word to trusted contacts at Fort Laramie about the possible corruption there." "What happens now?" Beatrice asked. "You stay here where it's safe until we deal with Blackwell." His tone brooked no argument. "Martha and the sheriff will look after you." "And you?" she pressed, though she already knew the answer. "I ride out tomorrow to meet a group of marshals coming from Denver. We'll track down Blackwell and his operation, once and for all." The thought of him leaving riding back into danger filled Beatrice with dread. "It's too dangerous. You've seen how many men he has, and if there are corrupt soldiers involved, it's my job," he said simply. "Your job may get you killed." The words burst from her with unexpected force, startling both of them. Martha discreetly retreated to another room, leaving them alone. "Beatrice," Russ said gently, "I can't walk away from this. Not just because it's my duty, but because what almost happened to you is happening to other women right now. I have to stop it." She knew he was right, but the knowledge did nothing to ease the tightness in her chest. Over the past days, this man had become more than her rescuer. He had become someone she cared for deeply. "Promise me you'll be careful," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. He reached across the table and took her hand in his, the first time he had touched her that wasn't necessitated by their escape. "I promise." The contact sent warmth spreading up her arm. His hand was rough with calluses but gentle in its grip, enveloping hers completely. "When this is over," he continued, his eyes holding hers, "maybe we could talk about what comes next." Her heart stuttered. "What do you mean? I mean?" He seemed to struggle for words, unusual for the normally composed Marshal. "I've come to admire you greatly, Beatrice. Your courage, your resilience. I'd like the chance to know you better in circumstances that don't involve running for our lives." A smile bloomed on her face. "I'd like that too." Their moment was interrupted by the sheriff's arrival, bringing news that scouts had reported riders approaching from the south, possibly Blackwell's men. Russ was immediately alert. "How many?" "8, maybe 10, Tanner replied. "Heavily armed." "They must have tracked us here somehow," Russ muttered. "We need to prepare the town." The peaceful evening dissolved into urgent preparations. Settlers Creek had experienced its share of trouble and responded with frontier efficiency. Men took up defensive positions, women and children were gathered in the sturdy church, and Beatrice found herself once again in the center of danger she had hoped was behind her. "You'll stay with Martha in the church," Russ instructed her. "No," she said firmly. "I won't hide while you face danger because of me." "This isn't a debate. I can shoot," she interrupted. At his skeptical look, she added, "My father believed women should be capable of self-defense. He taught me to use a revolver when I was 16. Russ studied her for a long moment, then nodded curtly. "Stay with me then, but you follow my instructions exactly." "Understood." "Understood," she agreed. As darkness fell, the town quieted, its normal evening activities suspended as everyone waited. Russ and Beatrice took position in the sheriff's office, which offered a clear view of the main street. "They'll likely come in shooting," Russ warned, checking his weapons methodically. "Blackwell isn't known for subtlety." He handed her a Remington revolver, watching as she checked it with unexpected competence. "Remember, stay low and behind cover." The waiting was almost worse than the danger itself. Minutes stretched into hours as the town remained silent and watchful. Beatrice found herself studying Russ's profile in the dim lamplight, the straight nose, the firm set of his jaw, the intensity of his gaze as he watched the street. "What will you do when this is over?" she asked softly. "After Blackwell is caught." He glanced at her, a hint of surprise in his eyes at the question. "Continue my work, I suppose. There's never a shortage of outlaws in the territories. Always moving from place to place? That's the nature of the job," he hesitated. "Though lately I've been thinking it might be time to consider something more settled." Before she could ask what he meant, a shout from the edge of town shattered the silence, followed immediately by gunfire. "They're here," Russ said grimly, extinguishing the lamp. "Stay down." The attack came swiftly, riders charging down the main street, guns blazing at windows and doorways. From concealed positions, the townspeople returned fire, creating a chaotic crossfire. Through the window, Beatrice could see shadowy figures moving between buildings. Russ fired methodically, his aim deliberate and effective. Beside him, Beatrice held the Remington ready but found no clear target in the confusion. Suddenly, the door behind them crashed open. Beatrice whirled to see a bearded man with a raised pistol. Without conscious thought, she fired twice. The man staggered, his own shot going wild, then collapsed. Russ was beside her instantly. "Are you hurt?" "No," she gasped, staring at the fallen attacker. I didn't." "You did what you had to," he said firmly, checking to ensure the man was no longer a threat. "You saved both our lives." The firefight continued for what seemed like hours, but was probably only minutes. Gradually, the shooting decreased as the attackers were driven back or fell. When silence finally descended again, Russ cautiously led Beatrice out onto the street. The town had suffered damage, broken windows, bullet-riddled facades, but had held its ground. 3 townsmen were injured, none fatally. Of the attackers, 4 were dead, 2 wounded, and the rest had fled. Among the captured was a man Russ recognized immediately. "Silas Crow," he said, looming over a wounded outlaw being tended by the town doctor. "Blackwell's right-hand man." The man glared up with hatred in his eyes. "Should have killed you when we had the chance, O'Malley." "Where's Blackwell?" Russ demanded. Crow spat. "Go to hell." "He's already heading there," Sheriff Tanner said, joining them. "And he's taking you with him if you don't cooperate." Dawn was breaking by the time they had secured the prisoners and tended to the wounded. Beatrice, physically and emotionally exhausted, sat on the sheriff's office steps, watching as the town began to recover from the attack. Russ joined her, sitting close enough that their shoulders touched. "You're trembling," he observed. "Delayed reaction, I suppose," she said, trying to steady her hands. "I keep seeing his face, the man I shot." "That feeling never entirely goes away," he said quietly. "Nor should it. Taking a life, even in self-defense, should never be easy." "How do you bear it?" "By remembering why it was necessary. By focusing on the lives saved rather than the one lost." He placed his hand over hers. "You showed extraordinary courage tonight, Beatrice." His touch anchored her, warm and reassuring. "What happens now?" "Crow has agreed to testify against Blackwell in exchange for leniency. He's given us the location of their main camp." Russ looked toward the horizon, where the sun was rising in a blaze of orange and gold. "The marshals from Denver should arrive tomorrow, then we go after Blackwell." "And the women? The others who were taken?" "Crow says most are at the main camp. If he's telling the truth, we'll free them." Hope flared in Beatrice's heart. Perhaps some good could come from this nightmare after all. The next day passed in a flurry of activity as more lawmen arrived for U.S. Marshals from Denver, led by a grizzled veteran named Jenkins. They met with Russ and Sheriff Tanner in the latter's office, planning their assault on Blackwell's hideout. Beatrice, meanwhile, helped Martha and other town women tend to the wounded and repair damage from the attack. The physical work was a welcome distraction from her worries about the coming confrontation. That evening, Russ found her at Martha's house, packing supplies for the injured. "We ride at dawn," he said without preamble. Blackwell's camp is in a box canyon about 30 miles northeast of here. Beatrice set down the bandages she was folding. How dangerous will it be? Crow says there are about 15 men left, plus Blackwell himself. Russ's expression was unreadable. We'll have the advantage of surprise, but it won't be easy. When will you return? If all goes well, 2 days from now. He hesitated. I've asked Sheriff Tanner to arrange an escort to take you to Helena once this is over, so you can take that teaching position. The words felt like a blow. You want me to leave? I want you to be safe, to have the life you came west for. His voice was carefully neutral. And what if that's not what I want anymore? She asked quietly. Something flickered in his eyes, hope, perhaps, or uncertainty. What do you want, Beatrice? She took a step toward him. I'm not entirely sure yet. But I know it includes the chance to explore what's between us without danger hanging over our heads. For a moment, he seemed frozen, caught between duty and desire. Then he closed the distance between them, his hands coming up to frame her face with exquisite gentleness. I've wanted to do this since I first saw you stand defiant on that auction block, he murmured, and then his lips were on hers. The kiss was tentative at first, as if he feared she might pull away. When she responded instead, leaning into him, it deepened into something that made her knees weak and her heart race. When they finally parted, both breathless, Russ rested his forehead against hers. I have to go tomorrow, he said, but I promise you, Beatrice Osborne, I will come back. You'd better, she whispered fiercely, or I'll come after you myself. The smile that lit his face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. I believe you would. Dawn came too quickly. Beatrice stood with Martha and other townspeople as the marshals prepared to ride out. Russ, mounted on a fresh horse, looked every inch the lawman determined, capable, dangerous to those who stood against justice. He guided his horse to where Beatrice waited and leaned down from the saddle. Remember your promise, she said before he could speak. I remember. His eyes held hers intently. Wait for me. Always, she replied, the word a vow. With a nod to Sheriff Tanner, who would remain behind to protect the town, Russ led the marshals out, dust rising behind them as they rode toward the rising sun. The next 2 days were the longest of Beatrice's life. She tried to keep busy, helping Martha with household tasks and assisting in the continued recovery of the town, but her thoughts constantly returned to Russ and the danger he faced. On the morning of the 3rd day, she was helping in the general store when a shout from outside drew everyone's attention. Horses were approaching a large group, moving slowly. Heart in her throat, Beatrice rushed outside with others to see the marshals returning. At the head of the column rode Russ, dusty and weary but alive. Behind the marshals came a wagon carrying several women gaunt, frightened-looking, but also alive. They found them, Martha whispered beside her. Thank the Lord. Russ dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, his eyes searching the crowd until they found Beatrice. In a few long strides, he reached her, sweeping her into an embrace that lifted her feet from the ground. You came back, she said against his shoulder, tears of relief streaming down her face. I promised I would. He set her down but kept his arms around her. It's over, Beatrice. Blackwell is dead. His operation is destroyed. The news rippled through the crowd, bringing cheers and expressions of relief. The rescued women were helped from the wagon, each met with offers of food, clothing, and shelter from the townspeople. What about the soldiers? Beatrice asked. The corrupt ones from Fort Laramie. 2 officers arrested, along with several enlisted men. The fort commander had no idea what was happening under his nose. Russ's expression was grim but satisfied. It will take time to dismantle the entire network, but the worst is over. In the days that followed, Settlers Creek became a hub of activity as officials arrived to take statements and arrange for the prisoners' transport to Denver for trial. The rescued women, after receiving medical care and rest, began making plans to return to their homes or start new lives. Beatrice found herself at a crossroads. The school board in Helena had held her position, sending word that she could still take up her teaching duties if she wished. But the events of the past weeks had changed her profoundly. She had experienced terror and courage, helplessness and strength. She had taken a life to save another. She had fallen in love with a man whose duty called him to danger, but whose heart called him to her. 1 week after the Marshal's return, she found Russ sitting alone on the porch of the boarding house where he was staying. The evening was mild, stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "May I join you?" she asked. He smiled, that rare, transformative expression that had first captivated her in the mine. "Always." She sat beside him on the rough-hewn bench. "I received another letter from Helena today. They need an answer about the teaching position by month's end." Russ nodded, his expression careful. "Have you decided?" "I have." She took a deep breath. "I'm not going to take it." He turned to face her fully. "Beatrice, don't make this decision because of me. Your independence, your career, they're important." "Yes, they are," she agreed. "But so are you. So is what I've discovered about myself and what I want from life." "And what is that?" he asked softly. "I want purpose. I want to help others who have suffered as I nearly did." She reached for his hand. "The U.S. Marshal's office in Denver has offered me a position as a clerk and interpreter. It seems my education and recent experiences make me valuable to them." Surprise and admiration mingled in his eyes. "Denver, Denver," she confirmed. "Where, I'm told, a certain marshal is due to be stationed permanently as a senior deputy." "Jenkins told you about my promotion," Russ realized. "I was going to tell you myself once it was official." "He might have mentioned it," she admitted with a small smile. "He also mentioned that Denver has an excellent school that's seeking teachers for the fall term." "You've thought this through," he said, his thumb tracing patterns on the back of her hand. "I have. I want a life that matters, Russ, one with purpose and meaning." Her voice softened. "And I want to share that life with you if you'll have me." For answer, he pulled her into his arms, his kiss containing all the words he couldn't yet say but she felt in the beating of his heart against hers. When they parted, he touched her cheek reverently. "I never thought I'd find someone who could understand this life, who would choose it willingly. I never thought I'd find someone who would see me as an equal, not a possession or a convenience." She leaned into his touch. "We've both been surprised." 2 months later, Beatrice stood in the small church in Denver, her hand in Russ's as they spoke vows before a gathering of new friends and colleagues. She wore a simple white dress, her honey blonde hair adorned with wildflowers. Russ, resplendent in a new suit, had never looked more handsome or more nervous. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister declared. "You may kiss your bride." As Russ's lips met hers, sealing their bond, Beatrice marveled at the journey that had brought her here from terror on an auction block to joy in the arms of the man who had cut her bonds and carried her to freedom. Their life together would not be without challenges. Russ's duties still took him into danger, though less frequently in his new position. Beatrice divided her time between her work at the Marshal's office and teaching at the school, finding fulfillment in both roles. Together, they established a foundation to help women who had been victims of trafficking, providing shelter, education, and a path to independence. It became their shared mission, a way to transform their own trauma into hope for others. 3 years after their wedding, they welcomed a daughter, naming her Hope in recognition of what had sustained them through their darkest hours. 2 years later, a son joined their family, bringing new joy and completion to their lives. On summer evenings, they would sit on the porch of their modest home on the outskirts of Denver, watching their children play as the sun set over the distant mountains. In those quiet moments, Beatrice would often reflect on how a journey that began in terror had led to such profound happiness. "What are you thinking about?" Russ would ask, his arm around her shoulders, his face lined now with both experience and laughter. And Beatrice would smile, leaning into the embrace of the man who had risked everything to save a stranger. "I'm thinking about ropes cut and new beginnings," she would reply. and how love finds us in the most unexpected places. In the distance, the mountains stood as they had for millennia, witnesses to the unfolding story of the West, a story not just of conquest and hardship, but of courage, redemption, and love strong enough to overcome even the darkest circumstances. For Beatrice and Russell O'Malley, their love story born in danger and nurtured through adversity was proof that even in the wildest places, the human heart could find its home.